My name is Linda Laurel. I'm a Convergence board member. I'm also a Houston Astros fan. So have a little pity on me today. Have a little pity on me today. I just have to say, you guys have an amazing team. And let's see what happens in the next couple of games. But they're fun to watch. They are so fun to watch. I, as I said, am a Convergence board member. And I also have a media production firm, communications firm in Houston. I'm a former news anchor of an NBC affiliate in Houston. So I'm a journalist at heart. And so much of what was just said by the congressman and Lindsay, I'm excited to pick up on right now with our guests. So our two panelists today have very long and distinguished careers, and it would probably take me 20 minutes to tell you all of what they've done. So instead of doing that, what I will do is just give you a very brief synopsis and then have them come up here and we will get our conversation going. We're going to be talking about the state of our democracy, today's reality and tomorrow's hope. And I loved hearing the congressman talk about the difference between optimism and hope. And today we are really going to focus on the hope part. As we explore the current political landscape. Linda Chavez is chairwoman of the Center for Equal Opportunity and a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center. She is a political analyst who appears regularly on Fox News and other cable news outlets. She's an author of several books, including her memoir, An Unlikely Conservative, The Transformation of an Ex-Liberal. In 2000, Chavez was honored by the Library of Congress as a living legend, wow, for her contributions to America's cultural and historical legacy. Please welcome Linda Chavez to the stage. Linda. And joining us also is Bill Galston, who writes the weekly politics and ideas column for a little paper called the Wall Street Journal. He holds the Ezra K. Zilka Chair in the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies program, where he serves as a senior fellow. He's a former policy advisor to President Clinton and other presidential candidates. He is an expert on domestic policy, political campaigns, elections, and a whole lot more. His current research focuses on designing a new social contract and the implications of political polarization. Please welcome Bill Galston. So excited to have both of you here. And I should also say that both Bill and Linda are guests on a relatively new podcast called Beg to Differ. I'm really enjoying it. I have already subscribed. Okay. Yes. And that is under the bulwark, yes? And the host of that is Mona Charan. So in our pre-call, as we were getting ready for today's event, we started talking about all the different things that we wanted to make sure we addressed here today, and talking about polarization in the country. Bill, you said that you think that our leaders are more divided than the populace itself. Why do you believe that?
I believe it based on the evidence.
Share, please.
And I wallow in survey research, and what I discover is that, to go back to one of Congressman Kilmer's visually arresting metaphors, the Venn diagrams of what Republicans out there think and what Democrats out there think actually overlap very significantly, even in some of the hottest button areas.
Where do they overlap?
Well, let me give you a big one: immigration. There has been a solid American majority, Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, for comprehensive immigration reform. It's existed for a long time. It still exists. It was particularly obvious in the year 2013 when the bipartisan Gang of Eight in the Senate designed a comprehensive immigration bill that was that was generous to all immigrants, including immigrants who arrived here not under the color of law, and very tough on border security at the same time. It got the vote of all 54 Democrats in the Senate in 2013, and 14 Republicans besides. It passed with a veto-proof 68 to 32 vote majority. If that bill had been allowed to reach the floor of the House by then Speaker John Boehner, it would have passed. And if it had passed, it would have been an accurate reflection of the actually existing American majority on that issue. Why didn't it pass? Answer: if it had passed in the House, which it would have passed with a minority of Mr. Boehner's majority, but a majority of Mrs. Pelosi's minority. And that is, I think, as good an illustration of the proposition that the Congress is more divided than the people are. But I'll go even farther, and then I'll yield back the balance of my time, which is negative. And that is that there was even a majority in Congress that mirrored the majority of the American people. The problem was that that majority was not allowed to express itself in legislation. And I could give you many other examples that fall into that same category. So we have various tiers of problems. The American people are more divided than they were when I was a boy or a young man or even middle-aged working for Bill Clinton. Right? We were not as divided a country then as we are now. The elected representatives, for various reasons, are more divided than the people, but our institutions don't minimize the divisions, they magnify them. So we have a popular problem, a problem of representation, and a problem at the institutional level.
So the question then is, how do we try to solve all of those various problems? Linda, what is your take on what Bill had to say?
Well, first of all, I have to make a couple of corrections. And I'm making the corrections in part because I think they say a lot about the discussion we're having today. I did work for 14 years as a political analyst at Fox News channel. However, because of my views on immigration, which is one of the producers told me confused my conservative audience because I am a conservative, and yet I was for immigration reform. I no longer am an analyst there, and now I'm on MSNBC and CNN fairly frequently. So, and I haven't changed, by the way. I haven't changed my views at all. I still say the same things as I've always said, but suddenly I'm no longer Fox. I'm sort of much more acceptable as the token right-winger on MSNBC.
I know how that feels, Liz.
Yeah, right. And so the second correction I have to make is that, Bill, you and I need to talk to Mona, because this beg to differ, I think we ought to call it beg to agree. Because you and I end up agreeing a lot more than we differ. And I have to agree with everything, really, that Bill said. There is a tremendous division among the leadership. And part of that, I think, really relates to the first issue that I raised, and that is the media and what's happened to the media. Bill and I are, we discovered, about the same age. He's a few months older than me, not much.
So why do you look 20 years younger?
Yeah. But we grew up at a time when it used to be 15 minutes of news back in the 50s and early 60s, and ABC, NBC, and CBS, you turn them on for your 15 minutes of news. Everybody watched the same news, and we could have conversations with each other, in part because we were dealing from the same facts. We might have different opinions, we might interpret things differently, but we were looking at the same issues, they were being presented to us in the same way, and we could have at least a basis for discussion. That no longer exists. And, you know, I am, I guess the president said, what is it he called us never Trumpers? Something about
human scum.
Human scum. That's right, human scum.
At least you're still human.
I guess I'm human. But, you know, I know a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump. Some of my best friends voted for Donald Trump. I did not, but many people I know did. But when I sit down to have discussions, as I just did just a couple days ago, I was out in Colorado where I spent a great deal of my time, and this happens to be where I grew up, and sat down with a couple of friends, and we started talking about what's going on in Washington, what's going on with the impeachment crisis. We could not really have a conversation because their set of facts were so different from what I think the facts are and from what I read, that it's very difficult to talk to each other. And I think this great division in the media is driving not just the leadership. I think you're right, Bill, the leadership is a problem, but it is also driving the base of the two parties. I think there are two problems. One is a problem with the leadership, and the other is the base of the Democratic Party and the base of the Republican Party, which comprises really a fairly small portion. These are the people who vote in every single primary election. They are not the majority of either party, and they're certainly not the majority of the country. But their views are now so divergent that it becomes very difficult to reach an understanding of what is actually taking place. As I read on the way into town, sitting in my Uber, Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham are about to introduce a resolution in the United States Senate that says the impeachment inquiry that is taking place in the House of Representatives is unconstitutional. I find this amazing. I find this difficult to comprehend. When the president himself kept talking about unconstitutional impeachment. One of the reasons I am a conservative, one of the reasons I have held on to my conservative views is the primacy of the Constitution and what I believe is a document that I would interpret as it was written. I don't really go along with the liberal view that it, is a living document, and what it meant when it was adopted is very different than what it means today. I think the words on the page actually mean what they say. And one of the things they say is that it is the prerogative of the House of Representatives to bring articles of impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors of a president. So how you could have a unconstitutional impeachment inquiry is beyond my understanding. That leaves me somewhat pessimistic, so I'm looking, and I was very pleased to hear the Congressman speak today, because maybe there is hope, maybe there's light at the end of this tunnel, but right now I feel we're in a very, very dark place.
So while we're on the subject of impeachment, and Bill, I'm going to come back to you in just a moment, but you, if I'm understanding correctly, were on the House Judiciary Committee during the Nixon impeachment hearings, correct?
Correct,
So
I
you
was.
have a very unique perspective, well, a little bit more unique, I would say, probably than anybody in this room, on what is going on and what the implications are. Well,
and I would be hopeful, based on my experience then, if I thought that we could get to the place we did in 1974, because when the impeachment proceedings began, when the Select Committee began to have its hearings, when evidence was being gathered, if you talk to the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee, there were almost none of them that were in favor of it. It actually took the building of a case, the acquiring of evidence, the presentation of that evidence, and witnesses coming forward to change the minds of people who wanted to be loyal to their party's nominee and president. I would like to be hopeful that we will see something similar take place in the months ahead, because I think there are some extraordinarily serious issues that are at the heart of impeachment right now.
So what's happening just in the last 24 hours is that the process itself is being attacked. We saw the many members of the Republican House go, really, literally storm the meeting yesterday, saying that they wanted more transparency and they wanted to see what is going on behind closed doors. Now, it's my understanding, and from everything that I've read and heard in the reporting, is that this process is playing out as it has in the past, and in fact, there are Republicans who were behind those closed doors that are on the committee.
Right.
Bill, what is going on, and how do we get past this point where it's not even being debated the substance, it's all about the process? Solve it for us, please.
You know, there's an old saying from the world of legal practitioners. You know, if you have the facts on your side, hit the facts. If you have the law on your side, hit the law. If you have neither, hit the table. Well, there's a lot of table hitting that's going on right now, and we will get past this. One way or another, the House will work its will, whatever that will turns out to be. I think it is, going back to one of Linda's observations, I think that it is almost a perfect symbol of what has happened to us in the past 20 years, that on the very same day that Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham announced their determination to introduce this mind-boggling resolution, Tom Daschle and Trent Lott published an op-ed in the Washington Post, explaining how in the midst of the tumult of the Clinton impeachment struggle, which as a broken down Clintonian I remember very well, it was possible for the two parties in the Senate to agree on rules of procedure that generated as fair, respectful, and dignified a process as was possible under the circumstances. But with your permission, I want to go back to a point that Linda made, which I think is absolutely fundamental, and which points to a very important feature of the convergence process. And that is that democratic deliberation, as the founders conceived of it, cannot even get started without a common base of facts, a shared understanding of reality. We can then argue about which parts of reality are more important and which are less important. We can argue about which parts of the existing reality need transforming, and if so, on the basis of which of many competing ideas. But unless we start in the same place, we cannot possibly end up in the same place. And having served on convergence convenings around particular topics, the process is designed with exquisite sensitivity to the foundational role of facts in the problem-solving process. I remember the most recent one that I sat on had to do with the looming crisis of long-term care in this country as our population ages. And Stuart, who was centrally involved, Stuart Butler was centrally involved in that process, can correct my memory if I'm wrong. But I remember that we spent months trying to get the facts straight and laying them out in a way that we could all agree to before we started arguing about policy options, right? And if we hadn't done that, we never would have been able to reach the agreement we did. And so I think in that respect, convergence is modeling the process that our democracy requires but now lacks. You know, it occurs to me historically, convergence should be unnecessary. Groups like Convergence should be unnecessary. The fact that they're essential in today's politics speaks volumes about today's politics.
It speaks volumes, and I'm just thinking back to some of the closing remarks that Congressman Kilmer had, and talking about the role of the media and all of this, that, to my mind, part of where we really need to focus, a big part of where we really need to focus, is all the way at the grassroots level in just basic human interaction and connection. And the fact that we're not connecting to each other. He's chastised for reaching across the aisle to talk to his constituents on the other side, or his colleagues on the other side. Part of we've got two different sets of facts when it comes to the media, depending on which station you're watching now, and as a member of the media, having, you know, come up at a time when I started my career, when it was still ABC, NBC, CBS, before the advent of CNN, before the advent of Fox News, and I saw in the newsroom how things were changing on a daily basis. And now, I think one way of getting around the, not getting around it, but one way to combat the silos from the media is to talk to each other on a grassroots and an individual level. And it pains me when I hear you say that, you know, if you go on Facebook or whatever and you try to reach across the aisle to talk to someone, that you get chastised for it. So I think at a grassroots level, when you are looking at, when you look back over both of your careers and you see the divisions that have happened, what's different now? What changed, do you think, aside from the media's role? Because I think the media's role was huge and is and will continue to be. But what else changed in your mind?
So much.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So much has changed. I mean, the culture has changed. We do speak differently now. The kind of language which we now hear politicians on the right and the left using, the vulgarities, the cuss words. Again, when I was growing up, you just didn't talk like that, and you certainly didn't talk like that in public, and no one would ever imagine emblazoning, you know, the F word or some other, you know, vulgarity on the across one's chest. You would never think of getting up before an audience like this and using that kind of language. So the culture has changed. It's changed dramatically. The whole, and by the way, I think the left plays a big role in that cultural shift. It didn't start on the right. I think it started on the left. It's now moved to the right and gone totally crazy on the right. But just the whole question of manners, the question of how you treat each other, how you address people, has changed so dramatically. It is very difficult to figure out how we get back to that place. Just standing in line at the grocery store, I am amazed at the language I hear. And if I had young children, I do have some young grandchildren, you know, you want to cover their ears. You don't want them to hear that kind of language and consider it to be acceptable. And yet that kind of language, which used to be sort of on the street and not associated with people who had high aspirations, regardless of class, you now hear everywhere. And so I think one of the things we have to do is to start there, to start cleaning up the culture, cleaning up the way we talk, because I think that is part of how we have gotten where we are.
Bill, you, as you said, have been at several Convergence stakeholder convenings. And one of the first things that happens around those tables, in those rooms, is the foundational building of trust. I just finished producing, Rob mentioned that I produced a video, an organizational video about Convergence. And so over the last several months, I've had the great privilege, actually, to interview many people who have taken part in multiple Convergence tables. And all of them talked about how when they would first get in the room, they really didn't know what to expect, okay? I mean, it sounds so aspirational, but I mean, you're talking about people who typically would not be sitting down together in a room, and just the idea that they can actually find some sort of commonality is, you know, like you might as well say, okay, I'm going to fly to Mars tomorrow. But what happens is once they sit down and they start to realize that the place that the other person is coming from is valid, and they start to listen without having the talking points to come back with immediately, the listening and then the trust is foundationally started, and then they can move forward from there. So, Bill, how do we take that approach and move it into the broader society, in our personal relationships, if you will?
I'm going to give you an answer that sounds like a joke,
Okay.
a very sad joke, but
Okay.
then I'm going to move on to a more affirmative expression. Engage in a long and very popular war. And I say that with deep regret, but in fact, and this is the beginning of how I would answer the question that you put to Linda, there was a period of some decades after the Second World War when we were a united country as never before and when partisan differences were at perhaps an all-time low. Why is that? Because an entire generation of Americans had gone through common bonding experiences in the Depression and World War II. And we had generated social capital through those common endeavors and experiences that we dined off for more than a generation. And what we've experienced really over the past half century, and a bit more than half century, is the erosion of that cultural capital and social capital and the development of increasing differences that exist both on the level of policy and ideology and also on the level of culture and the way we live. I could do an entire academic lecture. I was a professor for 30 years in, state institutions, but I'm not going to inflict that on you, so I'll do it in 30 seconds.
Okay.
Right? When I entered college in 1963, there was basic consensus on this country on economics, on national security, and on culture. Economics, as Richard Nixon was to say a few years later, we were all Keynesians now, right? And there was an open-handed Keynesian party and a green eye-shade Keynesian party, but we both were in the same frame of reference. National security, anti-communism, fight the Soviet Union tooth and nail, all of its proxies with our proxies, us versus them, etc. Culture, conspiracy of silence, right? Civil rights movement had not yet, broken through. There were barely the glimmerings of a feminist movement. Rachel Carson hadn't written Silent Spring yet. Gay rights movement. Well, we had, the famous episode in 1959, but that, that forced a lot of people underground rather than allowing them to express themselves. And what's happened in the past half century, and it didn't take half a century, it took about 25 years, is that all of those agreements in our politics broke down, right? Vietnam and the counterculture killed the national security consensus and the cultural consensus, and the stagflation of the 1970s killed the Keynesian consensus. And we haven't had common frames of reference across partisan and ideological lines since then. But I'll end on a note of hope, which takes us back to the beginning. I am enormously impressed with the young men and women who are returning from Iraq and Afghanistan and choosing lives of public service, including elective office. If anything is going to save us, it is these young men and women, and I hope they become a congressional and senatorial majority much sooner than in my lifetime, within the next decade, because I can tell you that a lot of what we're going through now will seem like a bad dream if we can get those people in positions of power and responsibility.
That would be wonderful. I had an opportunity to listen to, I think it was the most recent podcast that you two did on Beg to Differ. And Linda, you mentioned that you think that the foreign policy hawks will be the ones that kind of break the log jam, if you will, of those who are still supporting President Trump. Can you elaborate on that and say why you believe that?
Well, I think, frankly, the decision to pull out of Syria mm-hmm. so precipitously without any thought, doing it by tweet, doing it without consultation with the generals or any of the foreign policy experts in the administration was truly frightening for some. And Particularly so, not because of that 20-mile wide swath of land, but because of what it said about America's word to those who fought shoulder to shoulder with us and who frankly bore the burden of the casualties in fighting ISIS in Syria in particular. I think that was very sobering. I think similarly, as we delve further into what went on with Ukraine, there was an overwhelming bipartisan majority of support to give aid to a country that had been invaded by Russia and was facing on a daily basis the loss of life because of the fighting going on in one region in that country. When that aid was held up, and it was held up because of the president's preoccupation with, frankly, the Mueller report, trying to disprove that it was Russia that, in fact, messed with our election in 2006, and that Russia did that in order to help Trump be elected. And with his focus on the 2020 election and his fear that if a moderate Democrat is the nominee, that he will have a much more difficult chance to be elected. I think as we get more and more evidence that that is what happened and that this aid was held up for that reason and that there was essentially corrupt pressure brought to bear on a vulnerable country and a country that our adversary, and Russia is our adversary, has invaded, I think that you will see some breaking away. I've been told, quite frankly, that if there were a vote and it was a secret ballot vote, unlike what we have in Congress, and for good reason we don't have secret ballots, that Trump might well be convicted in an impeachment trial. But I do think that the more that comes out, the more there is irrefutable evidence of what took place. I think you will start to see some breaking away. I think you're starting to see some of it. I think Bill was exactly right when he said they're focusing on the process now because it's like slamming your fist on the table. That's all you have going for you. And I think that, frankly, Speaker Pelosi has done a good job so far in sort of laying out. We're going to have the first part of our evidence gathering is going to be done in a deliberative fashion. We're going to have lawyers primarily asking the questions. It's going to be done so that the individual witnesses do not get to hear each other's testimony so that it doesn't affect their testimony. And that from there we will proceed to an open public hearing. I think as that process goes forward, you will start to see the dam break. And it really doesn't take a lot. I mean, you only need a handful of people. They have to be not just, very junior members, but you do need to have only a handful, I think, to begin to speak up, to start seeing that dam break. I could tick off the top of my head a number of people whom I've yet to hear speak on this issue, who, if they were to speak up, you'd start to see things change.
You mentioned, of course, ISIS, the potential for ISIS to reconstitute itself as a result of the U.S. troop withdrawal from Syria. I actually had the opportunity recently to do an interview with a man who is a former recruiter for ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I interviewed him for my podcast, which is called Our Voices Matter. I'd interviewed him right before 9/11, the anniversary of 9/11 this year, and then I contacted him again after the troop withdrawal, and because I wanted to hear from him. Now, this is somebody who used to recruit for Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but now is working with the good guys, if you will. He has worked for the FBI, he's working with the NYPD, and he's working on countering violent extremism. And so now he's in Turkey and happened to be in Turkey when I did the interview. And I said, so what's the reality? What's going on in the back channels and the back networks? And he said, they're celebrating. They are celebrating. This is exactly what they wanted. We are playing into the playbook of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in multiple ways. And the division that is within this country was planned by Al-Qaeda. It was planned. And the fact that we are so at odds with each other that we can't even see what's really going on, we have the power to change it ourselves if we can figure out how to connect and talk to each other and realize that we're all Americans, we're all human beings, we all ostensibly want basically the same things, but what's happening is we are so siloed and we are so in our corners that we can't even deign to listen to what somebody else has to say. And while we're doing this, the folks who want us to do this are going, yeah, we got you. You're doing exactly what we want. So, I hope that, what we're saying here today is that we can find a way to do the work that Convergence is doing on a more individual and grassroots level so that we can connect with each other. So here's my question to both of you, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. What do you think is the implication of this impeachment inquiry and the divisiveness as we approach the 2020 elections? What are the implications? And Bill, I know you've done some research on this, so I'm sure you've got a lot to say. Yeah, it's like, where do you start?
Every time I think it can't get worse, it gets worse. And if this process doesn't come to a conclusion before the end of calendar 19 and spills over into the early months of 2020 while the Democratic, presidential nominating contest is in full swing, I'm afraid that the gravitational force of events in the Senate will be the reverse of helpful, either for the nominating process or for teeing up the general election. Having said that, I'm thinking back to 20 years ago, to 1999, when there was a Senate vote on whether or not the articles of impeachment of Bill Clinton, President Clinton, that came over from the House should be endorsed or rejected by the Senate. Despite the fact that those articles were rejected on a straight party line vote, not a single Democrat voted for either one of them, we were able to return to what passed for normal in American politics and conduct, and to conduct a reasonable election. In the year 2000, it ended unreasonably, but the election itself was a pretty normal election. But we were less polarized then. I think that all the signs are that the presidential election of 2020 will be one of the nastiest and most bitter elections since the election of 1800 between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Having said that, there is hope in that analogy because the bitterness of that election did not fully spill over into Thomas Jefferson's first term in particular. And Tocqueville has this marvelous passage where he talks about the tumult of American electoral politics giving way to a very different atmosphere in the wake of the election. So I'm keeping an open and hopeful mind as to what the post-election period is going to look like. I can offer no honest hope about the election of 2020 itself. I've already given up on that as anything but a model of what the democratic process should not be, but inevitably will be, given all the things that are shaping the environment of that election in 2020. But first of all, there are so many Americans who are tired of all of this. They're exhausted. They're battered. They want it to end. And so Warren Harding's famous, if ungrammatical, invocation of normalcy is not far from the center of gravity of what most Americans are longing for. And I wonder how long the political system can continue to deny a majority of Americans what they long for the most. The second area, the second encouraging area is that there are a proliferating number of organizations that are working at the grassroots level to try to improve the situation. I know I was a little bit involved in the establishment of one of them called Better Angels that you may have heard of, which is an organization that is trying to do on a group basis what both Linda Chavez and Congressman Kilmer were talking about more informally. That is actually putting together organized events of red people and blue people. And the only qualification is that they be willing to get into the same room, right? And civility is encouraged. The reverse is discouraged. But there's no way of screening out incivility completely, and so the combination of all of those things, I think, in the long run, will give us grounds to hope for a better politics.
Linda?
Well, first of all, I hope I make it through without breaking into coughing. For those of you who came up to me and I refused to shake your hand, now you know why. So, I don't know what's going to happen. Obviously, no one in this room does. No one does with impeachment. What I am hopeful for is that the American public will, in fact, take time, sit down, and listen to the evidence. And that members of the United States Senate will as well. And from everything that I have read and heard so far, and reading the opening statements that have been made public of some of the depositions that have been given, it's pretty compelling, and it's serious, and it is extraordinarily worrisome. So I'm hoping that people will, in fact, listen, and listen with an open mind. Whether you will actually see conviction in the Senate, I think that is highly unlikely. But nonetheless, even if there is an impeachment with no conviction, I think it will have an impact on the 2020 election, just as President Al Gore, if it didn't have an impact, if the Clinton impeachment didn't have an impact on the 2000 election. It will, in fact, hurt President Trump, even if he is not convicted. Because of our Constitution, we have to have 2/3 of the Senate vote to convict. I think there is a slim possibility that you might see a handful of Republicans vote to convict, as a couple of Republicans voted not to convict, as I recall, President Clinton. And if you see that kind of crossover and you have a majority of senators, even though it would not pass constitutional muster, I think that will have an impact as well. The problem is the problem that I think Bill and others I've talked to in this room are somewhat sympathetic is that you can't beat even a bad, terrible candidate with a candidate that a majority of the population does not find more acceptable. And that is a challenge not for my party, not for the Republican Party, but for the Democratic Party. I do think that there are enough of us who simply do want to see something like a normal president and a normal presidency, that you will see crossover. But whether that will be enough if the nominee of the Democratic Party is someone who a large portion of the population finds unacceptable and finds a threat either because of their economic policies or because of their foreign policy, that they will not accept them, it remains to be seen.
Okay, and with that, I'm going to let you guys all get in. Who's got some questions? David, and then Ron. Okay, about that.
As you talk about the kind of the breakdown of civil society, for lack of a better term, one thing I didn't hear was social media. And it seems to me that whether you're on the right or the left, social media enables us to kind of only listen to one side of the argument. And so it makes us more tribal. How do you think is the toothpaste out of the tube, or is there something we can do to try to get sides to talk to one another a little bit more rather than clicking and liking those posts that we agree with already?
If I could, is it okay if I go first on that one? It's social media, but it's not just social media. Yeah, it's also broadcast media. And so I will, I'll make two suggestions, very, much more briefly than I think the discussion deserves. First of all, there used to be, 30 years ago, up until about 30 years ago, something called the Fairness Doctrine. Some of you may remember it, but basically it required everybody who receives a federal broadcast license to give a fair representation of the range of opinion of a public affairs topic that the station chooses to raise in the first place. So you could not, up until 1988, you could not have broadcast stations, whether radio or television, that were politically monochromatic, right? The Federal Communications Commission would not allow you to do that. And there was a concerted effort, to remove those FCC regulations. They were removed in the late 1980s, and the rest is history. So my recommendation is very simple. Taking into appropriate account all the changes that have occurred in the structure of the media since then, return to a 21st century version of the Fairness Doctrine. It can be done by the FCC through regulation. It can be done by Congress through law. I strongly prefer the latter. It's very controversial, but if you actually want to fix that piece of the problem, that's what you do. Suppose now let's go over to the social media. Well, as I suspect a lot of the people in the room know, social media as we now know it was enabled by the 1996 Communication Decency Act, which in the famous Section 230 established a kind of immunity for social media platforms. They were not to be held responsible for what appears on them. And we have seen over the past quarter of a century the consequences of immunizing increasingly powerful actors in our society from responsibility for the social consequences of what they do. And I think the political system is at about at a point where members of both political parties, for different reasons, are thinking seriously about changing that. I hope that for different reasons they can agree to make those changes so that these platforms do have an appropriate measure of responsibility, are held to appropriate standards. There's been a certain amount of discussion just in the past few days about Facebook's decision to exempt from its anti-falsity norms the utterances of politicians. Could there be any better representation of where we are as a country than that decision? I'm not talking about judgment calls. I'm talking about things that according to all the ordinary canons of evidence, are simply false. Should they be allowed to appear on all fours with things that cannot be judged simply false? Or should there be some responsibility? I know where I stand, and it's not where everybody stands, but you can do that without violating a jot or a tittle of the First Amendment. These are not parks that we're talking about.
My only response is that requires somebody to be a neutral arbiter of balls and strikes. And if you look at the track records of large media and large internet companies, they don't have the wherewithal nor the track record to engender that type of public confidence to call the balls and strikes.
Well, there's a difference between calling balls and strikes accurately and being perceived by the people in the ballpark as calling balls and strikes accurately. And as everybody who's been to a ball game and the cries of, kill the ump, go into the air every time there's a call that goes against your team, yeah, I know what you're talking about, but that doesn't mean that you can't do it. You just have to be prepared to take the heat for doing it. And so if somebody says that the budget deficit last year was $1 million, when in fact the real number is almost $1 trillion, is it really beyond the wit of man to come up with a system that requires a social media company to tell the truth about that or to prevent people from lying about it?
No, but you all know how nuanced policy.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about nuances. I'm talking about things that are demonstrably false, and everybody in this room would agree to be false.
Well, my kids would always tell me when I was regularly writing a syndicated column, Mom, don't use sports analogies. You're really, really bad at it. And I'm not a huge sports fan, but I hate to tell you, Linda, I am a Nationals fan, and I have been watching the playoff series. And
You guys are good.
I know
You guys are good.
so darn good. But to get back to the question, you're right. If you're sitting in the stadium, it's really hard to tell whether the ump was right in calling the balls or strikes. But if you're sitting at home in front of the
see that little
TV,
square.
there's a little square, and there's a device that measures, the speed of the ball, and you know whether that ball went through the middle of the square or whether it went up or down. So it is possible to tell what a ball is and what a strike is. And I have to agree with Bill on this, that when you're talking about demonstrably false statements, there is a problem when we don't call it out. And I think you've hit on an important notion, and that is the responsibility of those who make money putting this stuff out there, taking that responsibility, and if they put out there false statements or messages that cause violence, that they ought to have responsibility for it, and they ought to take that responsibility. That you shouldn't be able to make money doing essentially promoting propaganda or promoting falsehood. So, maybe you and I should talk, and maybe we can form a little coalition of a conservative and a at least neoliberal on.
Now wait a minute. Them's fighting words.
On this issue, but I think that is important. I think trying to get to the point that we don't just let social media off the hook. But having said all that, I do have to admit to you that I closed down my Facebook account because, I mostly posted pictures of me dancing with my standard poodle or my African gray parrot jabbering away. But occasionally I would respond to somebody's political statement, or occasionally I would write something myself. And the vitriol, the hatred that would come through, I just thought, I'm too old for this. I don't need this. Why do I need to get my blood pressure up reading this nonsense? And so I shut it down. And while I have a Twitter account, again, when I occasionally tweet something, it's usually about a rock concert I've been to, or, when I went to see Guns N' Roses, I think I tweeted about that. I'm not so sure that social media, it's neither social nor media in certain ways.
It has so much power.
It has a lot of power.
It really
I
has
agree.
Too much power for not having been subject to the other media guidelines that are out there. It's time, in my opinion, too. Ron Pollock, please.
Convergence is really good at getting to consensus, and it sounds like we have a consensus about the Washington Nationals. So congratulations again.
Thank you.
I wanted to raise a more traditional problem that I think makes it difficult getting to yes, which is what Convergence tries to do, is get to yes on difficult issues. And I think it's a problem that has existed well before the acrimonious context we are in today, but that acrimonious context exacerbates the problem. And that is, I think that parties and interest groups tend to look at their North Star in terms of what they want to accomplish, and as opposed to what is practical to move in a direction that is helpful, even if it doesn't go as far as the North Star. And I see that time and time again. It's true on the Democratic side, it's true on the Republican side, it's true about a lot of interest groups. And I think this country tends to do things incrementally rather than in a revolutionary way, perhaps with some exceptions. So I guess I'd like to hear you talk about how the current context actually exacerbates that problem, which I think has existed well before we got into this very acrimonious situation.
Would you want to start that?
Well, I guess if I understood your question correctly, I think we are in a very radical period now. And I don't think it has, I think we have now a situation where we are not moving in a more seesaw kind of pendulum way that the country's politics have generally operated. I think that, whenever we went too far one direction, it seemed like the next election we'd sort of swing back, and that there was really, we were a centrist country, center left, center right, but centrist. I think the bulk of the population is probably still centrist, but I think the parties are being pulled by their extremes. And I think the political structure we have now with primaries taking place in states that are not necessarily very representative of the country, the early primaries, New Hampshire, the caucus in Iowa, for example, exacerbate this. And, our founders were not great enthusiasts of parties and sectarianism, I think. And we have become much more party-driven in recent years than I think we were in the past. I think people, those primary party voters, are diehard Republicans and diehard Democrats, or in some instances now Democratic Socialists. And I think that there is and I don't have evidence for this, and I'm hoping Bill does, because he's the evidence man. I think that is a problem, because I think we do best when we are more centrist, and when, even if we don't get that North Star, even if we only get half a loaf, it's better than no loaf at all. And how we get back to that, I think, is difficult given the way in which our politics is currently structured.
And I would say gerrymandering is also...
Oh, gerrymandering is extremely important, yeah.
Actually, this always gets an argument, but you're talking to a skeptic on the whole gerrymandering issue. And let me tell you why. The number of deep red states and deep blue states, has multiplied fantastically over the past 50 years, and nobody redrew state lines. The share of counties who deliver a supermajority of 60% or more to one party or the other has doubled in the past 30 years. Nobody's redrawing county lines. Something deeper is going on. And I'm with Congressman Kilmer on this one. Jerry, nonpartisan redistricting commissions would help a little, but the simple fact is that we have sorted ourselves geographically as Americans. And more and more of one kind of person lives in the big cities or metropolitan areas. More and more of the other kind of person lives in small towns and rural areas. And by the way, this geographical division is another great source of the divisions that we're wrestling with as a country. But let me get to the heart of the problem you posed. And go back to the loaf analogy. Well, if everybody agrees this is a loaf, and I want as much of it as I can get, then compromise is a matter of more or less along a single continuum. Okay? That's easy compromise. Somebody wants $100 million for a particular agricultural bill, and somebody else wants $50 million for it. You compromise on 75. That's the kind of compromise that still goes on. But what if there's no agreement as to whether this is a loaf? Right? Or what some people call bread, other people call poison. Right? That's hard. That sort of disagreement, which is qualitative rather than quantitative, is a lot harder to compromise on. So, and so I would just complicate your analysis a little bit by suggesting that it's not simply a question of, getting everything that you want versus only a portion of what you want. If what the other person thinks is good, you think is bad, you don't want to get less of the bad thing. You want none of the bad thing at all. Remember the anecdote that Congressman Kilmer told about what happened in that burger joint, right, where the Tea Party guy said, I wasn't sent here by my folks to compromise with you. I was sent here to stop you. That's the kind of politics you get when what one person thinks is good, another person thinks is bad. And that's what polarization means. We don't agree on fundamentals. That, it seems to me, is what's making life so difficult for everybody who wants a more decent brand of politics.
Okay, we have one more. I'm told we have one more question. I'm sorry, Kelly. I'm going to... No, please. Okay. And may I have some more water for Linda, please, if somebody could get some water? Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Linda.
Sure.
Thank you, everybody. So I happen to work with an organization that represents or has 100 members of organizations that strengthen democracy, governance and policy making, campaigns and elections, civic engagement. And one of the kind of the underlying of the principles that we put forth is that we're better together. And so this part it interests me that you're talking about how do we get on the same page fact-wise. How do we change our hearts towards each other? I hear a little bit about what you're talking about, Bill, so that we have a better understanding of what each other wants and where we're coming from. And to me, it seems that early on in the conversation, you were actually talking about we have a broken social contract right now. Can you each reflect for just briefly, I know because we're almost out of time, on what are some common elements of a new social contract that could help pull us forward?
You're still recovering. Well, a social contract is something that gives practical expression to a society's fundamental sense of fairness. Okay? We're all in favor of fairness, but we have different conceptions of it. And the struggle then is to come to some point of equipoise that most people in society could live with. One piece of it is economic, and that is the general proposition that as the country prospers, the fruits of prosperity should be as widely shared as possible. There should be, in a phrase, what's known as inclusive growth. It doesn't mean that everybody gets the same thing, right? It doesn't mean that there aren't conditions on participation. But it does mean that people who, to quote the president I served, are working hard and playing by the rules don't feel as though they're getting nothing for their efforts. It means they don't feel that they're just treading water as hard as they can to keep from sinking. There's no horizon of hope if your experience is that you're using all of your energy to keep yourself and your family from sinking, right? So a social contract to the greatest extent possible gives people a sense that if they do what's expected of citizens and breadwinners, that their efforts will be rewarded. It also means a social contract, I could go on forever, but I'll just stop with this. A social contract also means that there is some shared sense of what we all should do as citizens, as individuals and vis-a-vis other citizens. And you know, I think there are some very basic norms here, right? For really since the beginning of the Republic, the expectation is that if you're called to serve on a jury, unless you have a good reason, right, that is an expectation of you as a citizen. I would radicalize that. If you're a citizen who has the privilege of voting, you should vote. And I have studied countries such as Australia that have voting requirements. You know, it's incumbent on every citizen. The year after they passed mandatory voting, 1926, political participation rose from 59% to 91%, and it hasn't fallen below 90 ever since. That's enforced with a fine the size of an ordinary traffic ticket. Right? So a social contract that both restores a sense of inclusive growth and also a common expectation of what we do as citizens would be a big step towards the better country that I think we all sense is within our reach.
I am so glad, Bill, that you have finally said something that I can adamantly disagree with.
Great.
I was getting so worried.
It really looked like a fix, didn't it?
So you should say, Bill, I beg to differ.
Yeah, I beg to differ, Bill. Universal voting, it sounds wonderful. It sounds so patriotic. It sounds like what we should aspire to. And we should, if in fact we had an educated, and I don't mean educated in terms of degrees, but I mean a population that does understand what a democracy is and does understand what separation of powers are and basically understands what our form of government is. And we don't have that now. So I want to go back to what I think we need, and I think it starts a lot earlier. And I think part of why we are where we are today is that we have had a breakdown in our education system, primarily our public education system, where civics is simply not part of the curriculum. Students don't learn what it means to be a citizen in a democracy, what that entails, the responsibilities as well as the rights that entails. And I think if I were to figure out a way to try to make a difference, it would be in focusing on educating the next generation. I'm sorry to say that I think a lot of the folks in our generation, Bill, may be beyond hope. A lot of people in the generation even of my children did not go through that kind of education system. And I think if we want a future democracy that works, we've got to do a better job in instilling in the next generation an understanding of our system.
Well, thank God our elected officials understand the Constitution so well.
Oh, yeah, they do. They understand it so well.
Well, with that, I'm going to just say that this was a really wonderful conversation. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed moderating it. And the last thing I would like to say, in the words of my friend who is the researcher at the University of Houston and a best-selling author, Dr. Brene Brown, and she says, it's hard to hate up close. It's hard to hate up close. So if we can all just make the decision that we are going to get to know someone that we consider to be the other and have a real conversation, not on social media, but face-to-face, hard to hate up close. And with that, we're going to take a break and we'll resume shortly. Thank you so much.